I always like to say, how do you replace blame with curiosity in your feedback mechanism, but adopt a learning mindset? And what I mean by that is if you want to actually listen to your employees and you hit them with blame versus hitting them with a learning idea about let me understand your side of the story or your situation, it puts people in a especially from a psychological safety perspective, it puts them in a much better place when it comes to giving you any information that will be way more valuable when it comes to listening.
Hey, it's Nikki Llewellyn Gregory, and you're on Gut Plus Science. You're in for a fast-paced, storytelling, action item-rich leadership growth experience. I hope you make this podcast a habit. I consider it a leadership mentoring tool. Learning together makes us better together, and that is how we change the world around us. Let's get to it. So today's topic is tapping into the opportunity to help us sharpen our listening skills so that we can truly make impact via feedback. We all can get better at listening. We all can get better at feedback. We're just going to tie all that together. It's such an intentional effort, listening. When not prioritized, it's easy to start slipping up. From experience, sometimes I'm like, I'm so on my game. Like I was so focused because I'm looking for these three parts and making sure that I'm not thinking about my next thing before whatever. And so I'm ready to learn from you today. Rob Catalano is with me. Rob is the Chief Engagement Officer at WorkTango. His passion is to improve lives, improve work lives. Rob was named as a 2024 Top 100 Global Employee Experience Influencer. Dang. Yes, I have a solid guest per usual, but this one's going to be another new take on the topics of listening and feedback and tying it all together. And of course, making sure that we understand what they do at WorkTango. So Rob, let's start with, of all topics, we could talk about so many things. There's so much in improving work lives, but you were like, I really want to hone in on this listening arena of all topics. Why did you choose that?
Yeah, first off, Nikki, thanks for having me, and hello everyone. Excited to be here, and I love listening to what you have out there as well. So it inspires me, and I learn. But to your question, I think about the last 20 years in the workplace, listening and feedback has been a pillar in all of it. Right, I've spent decades building HR technology to help with employee recognition, which is a positive level of feedback, or listening to employee feedback throughout their journey. I've also spent a lot of that time listening to customers in order to build those organizations, listening to the data that comes with some of these types of initiatives. So I think if I were to boil it down to a couple of things, listening and feedback are definitely one of them, which I have a huge passion for.
That's so awesome. Well, we're ready to dig in. And I mentioned, lack of intentionality in my falling short is like what happens for me. It's like when I am intentional, I am so much better. And so I'm just curious what things come up for you when we think about where we typically fall short. Because you're talking with leaders all the time and you're seeing this data. What are we typically missing to maybe do a little checklist here as a listener? Oh, yeah, gosh, I kind of missed that and forgot about that. Where do we fall short?
Yeah, so I love that you use the word intentional. It's one of my favorite words, but you have to be intentional about what seems one of the simplest and easiest things to do, which is to listen. And I like to boil it down to three things: frequency, rhythm, and action. So what I mean by that is, are you listening frequently to people in your organization, people in your community, people in your life? And the reality is that we get so busy, to your point. So a big why, we have to actually have frequency. Again, we have to set a rhythm in order to make that space to do it. So many organizations I work with, or even with my team, there's a rhythm of weekly making sure there's listening and feedback conversation on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. So that rhythm is really critical. But action's what it's all about, right? You don't listen, just because it makes you feel good. You listen to be able to do something with that insight or data in order to follow up with feedback or an action, or maybe the inaction, maybe the why we can't act on that type of feedback. So I find that those are just three simple prescriptive ways of why people fall short in a really simple narrative around what we could do better. And whether that's individually or translating to how companies listen to their employees and provide feedback. I think those are just three key items and places I start to simplify it.
I'd love to then define listening well. Like, how do you put context with that to help us understand, like, what does listening well look like?
Yeah, so I love using the example of employee listening because we've all either been an employee to get feedback to our organizations, or we are the ones conducting those types of listening activities or initiatives. And And I'll go to the probably the one thing people know and remember more than anything. It's that annual engagement survey, right? That is where we're trying to listen to our employees to understand sentiment. Now, the reality is that's very frequent for how fast our companies move. It doesn't give us context in terms of a longer period of time. And the reality is, back to action, is no one has accountability to act when you're really only checking in once a year, right? A lot happens in that time. So what's interesting about that is that the definition into your question about what companies are doing well or how can you structure it is, many companies have changed from that once a year idea to what was called employee pulsing or getting more frequent and getting feedback from employees and listening that way. However, most companies just do it more frequently. So it's the same questions, it's pretty complacent, employees check out, and sometimes companies do it more frequently, quarterly or monthly. But I think what's really critical in the whole employee listening or continuous listening atmosphere is that it's being, again, intentional about what we're listening to. And what I typically have seen be successful or recommend to other organizations is two things. One is your listening to employees shouldn't just be about, the engagement survey, right? It should be around the entire life cycle. What's their onboarding experience, their experience in belonging in the organization, even exiting the company and everything in between, right? Through change management, wellness, and so on. So again, it has to be really about that entire employee life cycle, right? Not just one moment. But the second, I think, most critical part of the model of active or continuous listening is you need to do more than measurement, right? Yes, you can measure engagement or your DEI experience, but the magic is getting into what I call diagnostic feedback, right? Yes, you can measure and see those trends and get more frequent, but until you ask questions about, hey, we heard you, like, let's dig a little deeper, or we heard your feedback was negative, like, what could we do differently? Or even better, get ahead of it, right? We are going to implement something to better a certain element of your employee experience, right? What feedback do you have to guide us or inform us to move in the right direction? So we call it an active listening model, but frequency plus that diagnostic feedback is when you really start getting to listen, give you the right ammo to act. That's in terms of a model or a structure, I find that that's worked really well in many organizations or teams.
That's so good. And I have a soapbox that I go on because I worked with an employee engagement software company in my career. And I learned about the detrimental impact that annual surveys have. And a couple of things come to mind. Number one, there are so many processes out there still that are so clunky that they do the annual survey and it's like 6 months before all of the data gets collected because they're not efficient. And it's like, are those problems even still a problem? Are the people here that were having the problem 6 months ago even like, okay, so there's that point. On the other side, it's the awareness that our world is real time right now. And you think like you want your Starbucks right now, your life with your kids changes every day, your spouse, right? So one day, one conversation could change the trajectory of a person. And so, what I started to think about as you were talking, Rob, aside from my soapbox, is macro, meso, micro. And so, you were sharing a second ago much of this macro vision for, the structure and, this diagnostic feedback model, right? And then if we come down to micro for a second, we think, okay, how do we equip every leader in our company to practice active listening? Like that would be an example. So can you just kind of touch on for a second this like macro, meso, micro? Don't forget, this is a repeated point that it has to be practiced at the top. And so just talk, Rob, about kind of macro, meso, micro. Walk us through that for a minute and how we scale that.
Yeah, I'll use the same example we're using, right? Whether you are listening once a year or more frequently. By the way, I will say that anytime I mention frequency, people roll their eyes because of the 6 month process it typically takes them to get feedback to the right people that can do something with it. And I always say there's no such thing as survey fatigue, there's lack of action fatigue. Like people will fill out your surveys, they will have conversations with you. But the reality is, as long as you're actually acting on that or responding to that, it's more about that than the frequency of giving feedback. But to your point, once you identify the right macro focus on how frequently or what you want that feedback to look like, the middle part is really, and what I find a lot of people find value in, is making sure that data doesn't sit in isolation with an executive team or an HR team or an individual, right? That's where you start, and you need to really use leaders as a linchpin to be able to see that data in real time, right? The ability to have to your point, not waiting 6 months, but 6 minutes, people should be getting feedback of what people are saying or having conversations on so they can dig in and listen even further to what's more relevant for their team. So that's when leaders become that secondary layer of leveraging that type of feedback and listening into their own way. A good example, right? HR cannot have a one size fits all solution to fixing employee experience or improving the engagement. They need the support from leadership in their company. So I think that's the second part of it. But on the micro side of it, that's when you start getting into the team conversations, the individual conversations, adding context to what that listening means to the individual employee. And quite honestly, sharing that data with everyone in an organization to say, well, why do you interpret that? What works for you? What doesn't? So I find that, many organizations that are doing this and keeping the data just with a few folks or the HR team, it's doing your company a disservice. Not only from a trust perspective, but then using that listening to actually do something with it in an impactful way.
So good. And I know Work Tango helps scale great listening to help people feel heard across an organization and equips the leaders to take action on the right things that eliminate action fatigue. I love that point you made. Elaborate on this, like talk about what that looks like scaling the system across and how Work Tango fits in.
Yeah, to your point, one is how do you make it really easy for employees to get feedback for whatever you need feedback, right? It's basically allowing yourself to have that active or continuous listening, model that we just talked about. But the real magic is, how do you make sure that data in real time gets served to anyone in the organization? Like work with organizations that keep the data with maybe two HR people or 2,000 leaders to understand sentiment for their respective teams or departments or locations or their hierarchy or whatever it is. Well, now what you've done is you've eliminated that time for feedback to get to the people that can do something with it, and they have a ear to the ground of how their teams are thinking and feeling. But what the system then does is actually recommend actions to those leaders based on the data for their respective teams, right? And that's when you start getting that speed from listening to action a lot shorter than what's traditionally been the case. And again, more specific to those teams, right? Every leader has a different action plan or way they're going to get to success. So structurally, that's what the company does and what our platform does. But I'll preface on the idea of one, how do we make it really easy to listen to employees and any device, any browser, anywhere, and then two, get that data in real time to do something with it.
Do you have a story in your back pocket to share with us about the power of data that you were able to provide to a company, using this system that you're teaching us right now and watching the transformation happen because they focused on the right things that were the real things?
Yeah. So I actually just recently did a webinar with an organization. It's called Rexall. It's basically the CVS in the US equivalent. And, about 10,000 employees, hundreds and hundreds of stores in retail. And they started their journey listening to employees again across what they call continuous understanding, which I actually like better than continuous listening. But what they talked about in that webinar was one, measuring a baseline of where are we today to understand, is listening moving us to act in the right way to move the needle on metrics that really matter. So whether that's engagement or NPS or, leadership actions. So there's things that they talk about from that perspective. But then it's also honing in on different parts of the organization, right? When you're a large retailer, you have people sitting in stores every day. You have people in the pharmacy. You have people that are part-time and full-time, and just the ability to hone in, and we work with them on honing in specifically in their pharmacy group to understand what's working, what isn't, how could we improve that, and then seeing that isolated group see results go up into the right when it came to some of those actions. So just one example of many that I've had I'm lucky and had the pleasure to work with in organizations to see that type of impact with the foundation of understanding their employees.
So let's talk tactical for a minute. Do you have any tips? Like, you're a leader, you have lots of people that you lead and live in this leadership world with what you do every day. Do you have any tactical listening tips for just leaders on the front lines, leaders at any level? Like, how do you listen well?
Yeah, so I always say that there has to be, as I mentioned, that cadence and rhythm. So I make sure that there's, or I think everyone should make sure, and I've even mandated in organizations that there's at least weekly one-on-one conversations with your team to be able to have space to listen and understand and give feedback on people's experience, right? Everyone wants to be qualified for their next jobs. Feedback is a gift, but if we don't make space for it, to your point, it doesn't happen, right? We get busy and things get in the way. Now, I'm talking at a one on one level, but even at an organization level, companies should have a model to get feedback from their company, from teams and direct reports, but also building that cadence, right? So, for example, weekly, it's one on ones. On a quarterly basis, I do brutal facts sessions, and brutal facts are meant to talk about, hey, let me listen about what sucked this quarter, like what really didn't go well. And then we can talk about how do we, as a team, identify those ideas, prioritize them, and move forward on what's happening. Or on a monthly basis, we have a monthly marketing meeting or a monthly strategy meeting where we go through some of the components of listening to employees on what works for them, what doesn't. So again, a company level, team level, indirect level. But I think the best maybe tactical components that I can think of is there's two exercises I do when I talk to groups in person around listening and feedback. The first one is I actually give really specific instructions about how to draw a stick figure. And you think it would sound easy, right? Like draw a circle at the top right, the top center of the page, right? Next instruction, create a line stemming from the circle to the middle of the page from the circle. And so it gets down to about 6 instructions. And when people show their picture, none of it looks like a stick person. But the idea there and kind of the tactic is when we think like we're giving feedback to people and expect them to conduct the task, we don't come up for air and make space for them to listen, for us to listen on what questions they have or alignment that needs to happen from that end. So when we think we're giving feedback to folks without that space to listen and understand, hey, did you comprehend? Do we know what success feels like and looks like collectively? I find that's just a really simple way using an example like that where you need to make space for it, even when you're just giving feedback to people or asking them to do a task. So I think that's one. The second part, an idea I think is really tactical. I do another exercise where I ask people to come up to the room or leave the room for people. And I say, come into the room one at a time, and you're going to help me find a clicker. And that's part of the exercise. They have 20 seconds. But what I ask people in the room to do is one of 4 things. They either be very positive and cheer when the person is, looking for it. The second, to be negative and kind of not the nicest, level of feedback, but more, kind of booing or do you know what a clicker looks like? The third, give some direction, like, hey, you're hot and cold. And the fourth is just silent. And the idea when you hear from these people how that impacted them, to your question, think about the type of leader or person you are. Are you always giving positive feedback, which makes people feel good, but doesn't help them in the journey of hitting their tasks or completing something? Are you negative, which demoralizes people? Are you silent, which in and of itself makes people feel alone? And again, they don't have the space to even have a conversation on, again, a listening or feedback level. Or are you giving some direction, which helps them there, but again, didn't give them a feedback mechanism back? So those are just some examples that I find if we can bring it into daily, just simple tasks like drawing a picture or finding a clicker. Just a few ideas there that I think might help when people think about the impact of listening and feedback in their world.
So I was just thinking as you were wrapping up there, okay, it's the power in intentionality. We talked about that when we were kicking off. Like that kind of applies everywhere. Like where you spend your time and your energy is probably growing, whether that's good or bad. So the power of intention, the power of structure. So we talked about that and having, frequency, rhythm, and action as these core pillars, and then how we roll out this system is like a technology. We use technology for almost everything in our life. Why would we be doing manual annual surveys? So for those of you out there, like if you're doing that, just stop, right? Like you need to just get a system in place, a technology partner to be able to help you do that and to be able to scale that. I think the power of data tells a story. Data is real. It's reality. And it helps us to hone so that we focus on, just like in your success story that you shared, it helps us to focus on what is most important. Just recently, I had a guest on the show and he said, I have a new 3-question test. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said now? Does it need to be said by me? I was like, dude, that's so good. Like, and so it just helps you to filter, right? Like you have these pillars, you have the structure, you have your cadence for, or as you said, like the rhythm or frequency. So it's, the power and intention, the power and structure, the power and data, and then finally the power and clarity and authentic clarity. And we were talking about, yes, you can give feedback and it's always like, keep going, you're doing so great. And that's awesome. And that's, pump them up. But how do you give that very clear feedback, data driven, right, to help someone really grow? And that's where feedback is a gift. Otherwise, it's a nice to have.
I wanted to give some context around listening. And And then just some takeaways for folks. But I always say there's two types of listening to employees when you set up that conversation. One is you're listening for people's sentiment. Like, hey, how are you feeling about a certain example? Or how do you feel about work in a survey? But if you set it up that way, you won't get the right feedback and set up a listening environment. So the next part of receiving feedback is what I call participative management. And those are the questions around, well, what would you do differently? What does this data tell you or what does it not tell you? Many companies do that with retrospectives, right? Like what worked, what didn't, what are we going to do differently? So you have to set up the conversations to create the not just space, but the right space for employees to actually give you feedback. And that's when you listen, you're going to get way more valuable components. So that's just one. And then the second, I think when it comes to listening to employees, especially if you want to set that up, I always like to say, how do you replace blame with curiosity in your feedback mechanism, but adopt a learning mindset? And what I mean by that is if you want to actually listen to your employees and you hit them with blame versus hitting them with a learning idea about let me understand your side of the story or your situation, it puts people in a much, especially from a psychological safety perspective, it puts them in a much better place when it comes to giving you any information that will be way more valuable when it comes to listening. So what I mean by that is, you don't just call someone out. You start with what I call a problematic behavior as an observation. Hey, I noticed you were late 3 times this week versus being like, why are you late? Right. So there's just some tactics in terms of the approach there. Also engaging them in exploration. Like I imagine multiple factors are at play. Like, let's talk about that versus just assuming that they're late because it's their own volition. Right. I've had this conversation and people have responded, listen, I have another exec that keeps me in a meeting late. That's why I'm always late to this meeting. But again, it's out of their control. And then I find in that learning mindset, just ask for solutions. Like, what would you recommend we do differently? How can we work on this together? How can I support you? So back to that, feedback or structure, or even just kind of prescriptive tactical ways, not only to give feedback, but right environments to listen to employees. I find those have helped me and many other folks that I've worked in the last number of years.
Thank you for adding that, frivolous note taking over here. Might need to follow up with you for a coaching session on some of that. So I know you'll be sharing your information at the end so that we can all stay in touch and if we have further questions. Before we head over to our lightning round, though, I remember you saying something about this passion versus mission, but I don't remember what it was. Can you expand?
Yeah. So, maybe about 8 years ago when we founded Work Tango, like any company, they start with, what is your purpose and your mission and your values. And, we wanted to be compelling and we wanted to be different. And we said, you know what? We don't want a mission because missions end. What we have, and the reason why we started the company was because we have a passion, right? We have a passion to what we call improve work lives. And work is in parentheses because we spend a lot of our waking time at work, but that's what we've instilled into the culture of the organization. One of our what we call our passion statement, right? If your eyes light up for improving work lives, for our own employees, for our customers, then this is really what we do, bigger than the organization. And we know, I mean, even today's workplace more than ever, right? They don't want to work for a company; they want to work with a company to a bold mission or passion, which is what we call it. So yeah, that's just part of the Work Tango culture, and then what we talk about every day and how we pillar a lot of the things we do with our values and our other competencies that we have in terms of how we grow our company.
That's exactly why I wanted you to chime in on that. It gives me chills. Like I seriously get chills about that. I do love like the whole EOS model where you've got your rocks and your focus, and I'm very like, want to crush the goals. But that passion statement, it reminds me of why I love, leading with why or, focusing on why. We partner with a company called the Why Institute that has these assessment tools that help you find your why, how, and what that Simon Sinek had worked with to activate his book, Start With Why. And it's real similar to what you're saying, a passion statement or, the core why. And I just love that. It's what sustains. Like you said, mission has an ending and passion. Some days when I talk about to our team, I'm always saying, you guys, the enjoy the journey, not the destination. This is so like, this is it. Like we're in a dream right now. We get to do this because at the destination, we don't get to do it anymore. Oh, it'll make me cry. So with all that, this was so good. And I want to head over to our lightning round where let's learn a little bit more about you. And I think we have some fun questions coming up. Are you ready?
Let's do this.
What is your favorite book of all time or a favorite recent read?
It's funny that you brought up Simon Sinek because that literally is the book. It's a big foundation of a lot of what I've done for not only the passion of the company or the last, 22 years in the workplace. So it's a conversation I have. I've done some consulting on the side just with that structure, but I feel like I'm copping out if I use the same answer. So I'll put a second one, maybe Jim Collins, Good to Great. Like, how do you build wonderful things? So
So you're a heavy metal artist and a poet. Well, those two are a little different. Tell us more.
yeah, so I'll say those aren't my full-time jobs where I could, make a living on. So let's preface it with that. But yeah, I played guitar in metal bands growing up, and I have some published poetry out there in the world in early days, and don't really do that anymore. But you can translate that to songwriting, I guess. But yeah, one of the things you wouldn't read on my LinkedIn profile, that's for sure.
So my husband and I both share a background of like our early career stages in restaurants and hospitality. And we do retreats and always like, want to do like a 5-star dining experience and like just food and drink and all that. Well, one of the best cultures for that is Italian. And so I try to be able to be this great Italian entertainer, but I hear you might have an upper hand.
Yeah, so I'm actually first generation Canadian. My parents and their parents and pretty much everyone else, especially when you do those DNA tests online, are all born in Italy and from Italy. So that's like 95% of my background. So grew up in with that mindset and focus on food and family, or kind of 1 2, pretty much 1A 1B, let's call it. I have my citizenship, so I travel there as much as I can to see the journey from a different part of Italy versus where my family's from. But a proud Italian Canadian, let's call it.
Do I have it down? Rob Cantilano.
There you go, perfect.
Nailed it. Nailed it. I only practiced once, guys. The best way for listeners to connect with you after the show today.
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. I love connecting with like-minded folks. So that's probably the best place. Or email rob@worktango.com. Check that very often also. But yeah, again, love the ability to connect. So looking forward to it.
Rob, thank you so much for helping us to activate a scalable system for feedback via listening. Loved learning from you and all of the great work that you're doing in this area. Here's my truth you can act on from our conversation today. Number one, intentional listening focuses on frequency, rhythm, and action. Number two, get rid of annual asks for feedback. We need much more frequent of a system. And remember that one day can throw someone off track. So, us depending on the annual surveys does not work. Got to get rid of that. And when we hear of survey fatigue, it's not survey fatigue, it's lack of action fatigue. Number three, practice active and continuous. Number four, practice diagnostic feedback. Number five, leverage data to hone in on what is most important to make change happen and people feel heard. Data is key. It's so important to leverage data and not assume. We talk about that a lot on the show. And number six, have go-to active listening activities to practice with your team. And as an executive leader, have a few different activities that you teach to all of your different managers or leaders at every level to help create these regular experiences for team members where all people get to practice active listening. When people feel heard, there's so much power in that, to feel heard. So thank you again, Rob. We'll see y'all next time. We just left the world a little bit better. Now, go do something with it.